Hi, everybody. I'm Matt.
And I'm Steve.
And this is Marvel Reread Club. And we've got returning guest Rob Salkowitz, who writes about comics for Forbes magazine. Welcome, Rob.
Hey, nice to see you guys.
You're a repeat guest, so that means you're officially now a friend of the pod.
I'm not an enemy of the pod. I will destroy you.
No. Well, you can be. That's perfectly acceptable if that's the role
Recurring supervillain. How Marvel is that,
right? Indeed.
Rob, it's been a long time since you were last a guest on the podcast. Do you want to reintroduce yourself briefly?
Sure. My name is Rob Salkowitz. I'm a writer and sayer of things about comics. As you point out, I write for Forbes of all places. I write for ICV2, which is the industry trade pub for the comics business. I do this and that for Publishers Weekly. I teach comics at the University of Washington, comics and marketing, among other things. And I do various other weird things. I wrote a book called Comic-Con and the Business of Pop Culture a few years ago. And I'm now up for my second Eisner Award for some reason.
Nice.
Great.
Congratulations on that.
As best comics journalist?
Best comics journalist. I didn't win last time. I probably won't win this time, but it's nice to know that at least the first time it wasn't because they made a mistake or there was a typo or something.
As they say, it's an honor just to be nominated.
In this case, it truly is.
So, Rob, we tend to stick to comics on this podcast, but can I briefly talk about something other than comics? I encountered you in the wild. I am apparently one of the only people who is a member of the subreddits for both Bob Dylan and Taylor Swift. Generally speaking, the people in the Bob Dylan subreddit do not like Taylor Swift. And I am very alone when I talk about how wonderful Taylor Swift is on the Bob Dylan subreddit. And you went further afield of your usual comics topics, and you wrote an article for Forbes about how Taylor Swift's new album, The Tortured Poets Department, has similarities to Bob Dylan's album, Blood on the Tracks. And this is sort of her Blood on the Tracks. I thought it was a brilliant article. I was happy to encounter someone who I knew from this podcast out in the wild in a completely unexpected way. But I encountered this on the Bob Dylan subreddit where they were furious. They had white hot rage, and they did not say, we read this article and here is why we dislike it. The mere existence of this article, the mere existence of this headline, which they could not read beyond, made them so furious. There's been other subsequent things on the Bob Dylan subreddit where people are asked who else do you listen to besides Bob Dylan? Or who do you consider to be the new Bob Dylan? And I'm like, Taylor Swift. And people just, they can't take it. What has been your experience of having written this article, which I thought was excellent?
So that article was probably my highest click article of the last quarter. So that part is good. And I don't care if people are clicking in love or hatred or curiosity. Some people were tagging me on Twitter about it. The funny thing is, I am as enormous a Bob Dylan fan as you're going to find anywhere. I do not think that there was anything that Bob Dylan has recorded since 1959 that's on a record somewhere that I have not heard. So I am hardcore about this for decades. I can quote chapter and verse on Bob. I think
Well, no, that was clear from the article.
I'm very recently started listening to Taylor Swift because I've realized I'm a writer on pop culture for a major publication, and I probably couldn't have identified a Taylor Swift song if I heard it in the supermarket, which is bad. A lot of people like Taylor Swift. So I asked a friend of mine, actually an old blogging buddy from the days that Steve and I were doing blogs, he's a huge Taylor Swift fan. He's our age. And I asked him, and he made me a playlist of stuff. And he said, listen to this. If you like this, you might like it. And I listened to it and I thought, this is fine. This is very good. I had in my mind when I heard what the new record was about, that this could be a thing. And so I listened to the new record with this in mind, and I thought, I'm right, there's a story here. So I wrote it. And if the Bob guys hate it, I'm sorry that Bob fandom is toxic, but it's unsurprising. I'd be curious what Bob himself would have thought of it, to tell you the truth.
You're saying that there's a fandom that's toxic?
Go figure, right? And it's a fandom that appeals to old guys, and it's toxic.
Yeah.
What world are we living in?
Okay, so I realize this is a comics podcast. We should get back to talking about comics, but I wanted to tell you, I liked that article. I thought it was a very interesting perspective, and I congratulate you for writing it and getting so many clicks, even if some of them were toxic fandom hate clicks. I was going to say that I was not a big fan of the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, but I became an enormous fan of the directors when one of them published an article about the movie's toxic fandom. Hey guys, be cool. Don't Be Toxic fans. And I'm like, oh, I'm so glad to have a creator actually reaching out and saying, don't be toxic fans.
Well, put it this way, all things equal, I'd rather be on the wrong side of Bob Dylan fandom than on the wrong side of Taylor Swift fandom.
Yes. Not surprising.
Just saying.
You do not want the Swifties coming after you.
I haven't encountered anybody that's a fan of Taylor Swift that didn't like that article. So
there you go.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get into talking about some actual comics. We are just at the end of 1966 here. So you were with us for the end of 1966. Also, you were going to be with us here for our 98th and 99th episodes.
And always, Rob, if it gets to the point where we've been recording for 3 hours and we're not done, then you can call time at any time.
I have a hard stop when the puck drops for Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals. That's which is like in 3.5 hours, so I think we're good.
Let's go ahead and jump on in here. First, we're going to be talking about Amazing Spider-Man number 43, Rhino on the Rampage. We have a nice action cover here with Spidey getting thrown around by the Rhino, grabbing onto his horn. So we start with the Rhino just breaking himself out of prison. You know, we get some J. Jonah Jameson being prickly.
Well, we see that Betty Brant and Ned Leeds are finally engaged.
Yes, that's what J. Jonah Jameson is prickly about. It's just like, people happy in my office. I don't like that. You should be making me money right now. Pete is still on this long-delayed first date with Mary Jane, chaperoned by both of their aunts here, but they don't seem to be letting that get in their way much. They are really hitting it off, despite Pete's green pants with a blue sport jacket. But we see that, Mary Jane is very just fun and bubbly, and she, likes to dance, and she's very flirty, and Pete is into it.
Years later, there would be a comic in which Deadpool traveled back in time to the era of Romita Spider-Man, and Mary Jane was just constantly dancing in every panel. It was quite funny, and I kept thinking of that with Mary Jane dancing here.
So Pete sees that the Rhino is on the loose, and he's like, oh no, I have to do something about this, but I'm on this date that I don't want to end. So then she's like, wow, man, stuff's going on in the city. We should go see the Rhino doing his thing. And Pete's like, hey, that's actually a great idea. So they get on his new motorcycle and go. We get the Rhino reminiscing about how he became the Rhino, and he was basically just a thug who then has two particularly scientifically advanced criminals saying, hey, you know what? Everyone says you're stupid, but we actually think you being stupid is great. So, hey, do you want to be part of this experiment? He's like, man, as long as you pay me, I don't care. Which is about the same as the Scorpion said back in the day, isn't it?
Basically.
So they go and bond this Rhino hide onto him, and it also give him super strength. But little known to them, it also makes him no longer as stupid. He doesn't come across as having gotten smart to me, but, what you gonna do? So once Pete and Mary Jane are at the scene of the action, he says, hey, man, I gotta go sneak up closer to get some good photos. And she's like, all right, sure, you go do that. And it works out great for him. So he goes and sets up his camera, has a really great fight scene with the Rhino. Let's see, why does Spider-Man have to jump away for a minute here? Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, he jumps up out of the way for a minute, and then the cops come by and start shooting at the Rhino, who is then charging at the cops. So Spidey has to come down and continue fighting him. Here's where we get what happened on the cover, where Spidey grabs the Rhino by his horn, and actually here he throws the Rhino with it. On the cover, it looked like the Rhino was throwing him. One way or the other, some nice horn action. At the end of it, he gets back into his suit. Oh, actually, yeah, it looks here like he's actually got pants of the right color, rather than earlier. Maybe that was just a coloring mistake. I don't know. He drops her off at the end. She's had fun because there's been lots of action, and, this guy on a motorcycle who she finally met, and, it's all great. He's great because, this is Mary Jane. And he's like, wow, okay, this is awesome. He goes by the Bugle, and Pete's like, oh, dude, I got some pictures for you. So Jameson loves them and says he's going to give him a bonus. He's like, oh, yeah, I can use the money. He's like, money? Who said money? Foswell, get him a key to the washroom and put his initials on it. So that's his bonus, is he can now use the bathroom in the offices there. So Spidey, at the scene where he fought the Rhino, ended up finding a little fleck of the Rhino's hide that had chipped loose at one point during this fight, and he takes it over to Dr. Curtis Connors' lab. Dr. Curtis Connors is, of course, otherwise known as the Lizard. So, and he has worked with Spidey before and knows that Spider-Man also is clearly a chemist of some sort, even though he doesn't know anything more about him. Spider-Man wants his help to get this thing analyzed, so they analyze it, and Spidey goes off to do something about it.
So this is the second issue in a row in which Spider-Man has, I'm going to use my scientific brain to figure out a way to defeat this villain, just like he did with John Jameson in the last issue.
Yes. Good point. Spider-Man now has figured out how to defeat the Rhino, although we don't necessarily know that yet. So he's just been staking out John Jameson's hotel room where he has his government guards, but obviously those aren't really going to stop the Rhino. Spider-Man breaks in through the window of the hospital room as soon as he sees the Rhino break through the door. We have another fantastic fight scene here in the hospital. First panel on page 17, that pose of Spidey coming in through the window is just stellar. That is just absolutely fantastic. Spider-Man essentially wraps up Rhino in webbing. It's like a thin gauze of webbing, and it doesn't seem to be doing any good. The Rhino is still able to move around and create all sorts of havoc, but then it turns out with the chemical analysis that Spidey did with Dr. Connors, he was able to modify his web fluid to be able to dissolve the Rhino hide. So he dissolves the Rhino hide and knocks the guy out. Of course, J. Jonah Jameson still thinks that Spider-Man is the villain here, although John Jameson has gone back to knowing better at this point. We then have a big milestone in the Marvel Universe here on the final page. First panel of the final page. Petey is out on his motorcycle and sees a car, and he says, "Gwen Stacy out with Flash and Harry. Hi, people. Are you coming back late or starting out early?" One of them, I don't know which one of them because they're in silhouette, it says, "We all went out to discuss the big news, Peter." "What big news?" "Didn't you hear? Flash has to report for a draft physical." "Yeah, all of a sudden they can't win the war without me." "Did you get your notice yet, Pete?" So we have had the Vietnam War show up as a plot point here and there throughout the Marvel Universe so far, most notably with the origin of Iron Man. There have been Thor stories that were set in Vietnam, and there is a Captain America story. So we've had that, but this is the first time the draft comes up. I find that huge because, the Vietnam War is going to be a huge thing culturally going forward, both in American culture and in Marvel Comics from this point on.
Well, Pete here wonders if he'll be drafted. And of course, if Pete is wondering if he'll be drafted, then that sort of says there is a war going on and our hero is fighting age and our hero is not going. He does not intend to go willingly. So it's like, okay, this is not Captain America. This is not someone who's saying, sign me up first thing. And I'm going to keep trying to sign up no matter how many times they refuse me. This is someone who is not signing up. And if he goes, it will be because they force him to go and they haven't forced him. So he's not going. That's interesting. Just in terms of changing definition of what a hero is.
Yes, and then Pete gets home and realizes that Aunt May isn't feeling well. He realizes that she has been rationing her medication for whatever her vaguely defined illness is, presumably a heart issue of some sort. Then that must mean not only is she in ill health, she also must be out of money again. And so let's see. Why does he end up breaking a date with Mary Jane? Was it just because he doesn't have enough money at this point? I think that's it. But so he then says, sorry, something came up. Mary Jane can't make it out tomorrow night. She's like, hey, no problem. He's like, wow, she didn't even really seem to care. So at the end of this issue, in this last page, we get the Vietnam draft coming up as an issue. We get Aunt May's health problems coming back, we get money problems coming back, and we get dating problems coming back, all in 9 panels here.
Yes. Rob, what was your reaction to this issue?
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree. I think that he had Spider-Man was pretty much dialed in. It was just a perpetual motion machine of the formula works. Ditko had left. I think Stan is leaning more into it because he's got to take more of the creative load, because I don't think that Romita is quite the storytelling dynamo that Ditko is. He can certainly pace the story out. He can draw the pages really well, the action moves really well, but he's an artist. So more of the impetus of where the story is coming from is from Stan in this case. I'm glad this was one of the ones to reread because I'm sure I've read this issue, but this month I actually had the origins of 2 characters that I knew they had origins, but I forgot what they were. Now we get the origin of the Rhino. So that was pretty cool. And I forgot how he dealt with the Rhino. I just thought he was hauled off in handcuffs still in his Rhino suit, but apparently they found a way to solve the Rhino.
Yeah, 2 issues ago, he fought the Rhino and they hauled him off in handcuffs, which, as you can see, didn't end very well. So he had to come up with a more permanent solution.
I mean, him and the Juggernaut and some of these like big dudes that charge headfirst into stuff. I'm not sure about the right correctional facilities for them. But the other thing, the other cool thing in this issue is Mary Jane is hands down the best female character that Stan wrote all through the 60s, in my opinion, which is a small, it's a low bar because most of Stan's female characters are terrible and they read like spoiled rich housewives, or I don't know where these characters come from. Mary Jane, for all of her over the topness, actually seems like a real person. And I'm kind of wondering where the inspiration for that came from. Was Stan's daughter getting to be teenager or something like that? Like, did he have some real life example? Because she reads a little bit more like an actual female than most of the other female characters that we've run across in Marvel so far.
If you want to see what a great character Stan Lee's Mary Jane is, just compare her to Brian Michael Bendis' Mary Jane. Later, they would have Brian Michael Bendis rewrite these comics and these characters in Ultimate Spider-Man, and those comics aren't terrible. I read them, and then I recently reread them. I did a complete Ultimate Comics reread. There's some good writing in those comics, but generally speaking, they're all inferior to the original Stan Lee comics, and nothing is more inferior than Mary Jane, who becomes the most generic WB show bland heroine in Bendis's comics. And compared to the amount of just explosive personality she has in this issue and in all of her appearances. And there was the sense that we're writing 21st century comics now, and we're not going to do something that's embarrassing. And there's nothing more embarrassing than personality. That makes for cringy comics. And we don't want that. We want bland, reliable WB Network comics. There's nothing worse, and just so wonderful reading this issue.
Well, the best revision of this era was the Kurt Busiek Untold Tales of Spider-Man.
Yes,
it was
much better.
I don't know, late 90s, early 2000s or something like that, where he's kind of getting into the cracks of some of these stories and he's revisiting the original continuity. But generally speaking, I mean, I've never been terribly interested in Spider-Man, even at his very best. So it's like, this was a perfectly good Spider-Man story. I would say of the books that we read, this is right in the middle of the pack in terms of interest and appeal for me.
Just a few more things to add about the issue. I think this is a good issue to wrap up various storylines. This is sort of a 3-issue storyline with John Jameson and the Rhino that wraps up nicely here. And of course, MJ being the biggest part of the storyline. My favorite MJ line is when she, actually wants to go see the Rhino, which Pete is so happy about. At one point, she says, "You're utterly mad, lad." I like that line of dialogue. One thing they haven't done in a while is they give us a whole page showing how his camera setup works. It's sort of like how they do whole pages occasionally of how Iron Man is able to fit his armor into his attaché case. And every time I'm like, the more time you spend explaining this, the dumber it sounds. Do not try this. You will never convince me that this armor would fit in this attaché case. Well, never try to show us how Pete's webbed up camera works, because if you know anything about photography, these would be the world's worst photographs. These would just be absolutely terrible, unusable photographs. And unless they have Peter inventing some sort of AI tripod that knows how to swivel around and get the right shot, that would be one thing. And he is a science guy, but oh my God, it would be so dumb.
Two things I forgot to mention. So when Pete asks Mary Jane to watch his motorcycle while he goes and tries to get the photos, in the crowd, there's a funny exchange. One guy says, "If I was in charge, I'd toss an A-bomb at him from the roof." And somebody says, "Could be that's why you're not in charge." It's just lovely dialogue. And then later when Pete is asking her out for another date, she says, "I had promised Rock Hudson, but I don't want him to take me for granted." It's like, oh, sweetie.
Yeah, you're gonna be disappointed with that one, I'm afraid.
I believe so. All right. So, Matt, why don't you tell us about Tales of Daredevil?
All right. It is always a step down when we go from Spider-Man to Daredevil, even when they briefly had the same artists. But let's go to Here Comes Daredevil, the Man Without Fear, number 23, DD Goes Wild. We have a very exciting cover here where Daredevil is in an arena. He is ducking down while the gladiator leaps over him with his whirling saw blades on his hands. And just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, there's a lion that is also pouncing on him, which makes for an exciting cover. I really like the way that the gladiator is drawn flying through the air. We've talked before about how much Gene Colan loves splash pages. Well, this time, for the first time I think ever in a Marvel comic, he starts with 2 splash pages in a row. He just really loves it. Daredevil is still in Madison Square Garden in a boxing ring fighting the Tri-Man, who is a android made out of combining a wrestler, a safecracker, and a criminal mastermind. Then they put him to work doing something that is neither wrestling, nor safecracking, nor criminal masterminding. Meanwhile, the Masked Marauder and Gladiator are speaking to him through the PA system in Madison Square Garden, saying, we're going to attack Karen and Falky unless you agree to surrender. And they're like, we're going to teleport the Tri-Man back. And he's like, you can't teleport the Tri-Man back. I'll grab onto him and teleport myself with him. And they're like, no, that's what we were threatening you with. We were saying we were going to teleport you here unless you surrendered. We were telling you to surrender to us, and instead you're voluntarily surrendering, seemingly to thwart us. They're perfectly happy with this situation. He shows up, and he's in a test tube along with the 3 villains who formed the Tri-Man. Then instead of fighting the Tri-Man, who is supposed to be the ultimate man, who is a combination of these villains, he fights the individual villains who are seemingly happy to fight Daredevil rather than going like, hey, let's fight the people who stuck us in tubes. He goes ahead and fights them one by one and then fights Gladiator. Meanwhile, the Masked Marauder is still doing his Zoom meeting with the Mafia, who are meeting in at Mafia headquarters across the sea, presumably in Sicily. You know, the Masked Marauder is like, I am still trying to impress you. Why don't you go ahead and use this teleporter now to teleport the Gladiator and Daredevil to your fighting arena in, presumably, Sicily. They go there, and again, this is a little bit unclear whether or not this is something the Gladiator wants or doesn't want. I do like the idea of finally having the Gladiator get to be a gladiator fighting in a Roman Colosseum. I think that that's a lot of fun. Gladiator and Daredevil continue to fight. They decide, just to make it more interesting, to go ahead and release a lion in there with them, like a real old-fashioned gladiator battle. Daredevil manages to put the lion away, and the Gladiator is happy that Daredevil has saved his life. This is not the beginning of Gladiator going straight. He'll have lots of villainous time left before he eventually goes straight. The Mafia just sort of sends everybody on their way. I guess they go ahead and offer Gladiator a job. They, over Zoom, they tell the Masked Marauder to pound sand and say, nope, sign off, Masked Man, you've had it. And then Daredevil just sort of walks away from the Roman Colosseum type building surrounded by ruins, seemingly. And Daredevil's like, I can wander around in costume this way, but what do I do? I have no money, no other clothes, nowhere to turn. And then he just sort of trudges off. It is a bizarre issue. You know, I think if this whole issue is just an excuse to see Daredevil versus Gladiator in an actual Italian Colosseum, then I guess it's all worth it. That's a very fun idea, and they make it happen. So, yay. I guess that's great. But it's a really typically crazy issue. I'd say pretty good Colan art. I did not read the credits. The credits were story, Stan the Manly, art, Gentleman Gene Colan, inks, fearless Frank Giacoya, lettering, Swain Sammy Rosen. I think excellent inking by Giacoya. He's always very good on Colan. You know, I would say really nice Colan art. Rob, what do you think of this issue?
Well, it's what I think about all Daredevil from this era, which is you got Iron Man and Hulk as backups in these other books, and for some reason Daredevil has his own full comic book full of bonkers, ridiculous, weird, derivative, time-wasting stories like this one. And I think Daredevil is about to ascend to mediocrity in a couple of issues, but it's going to be like 100 issues before Daredevil is anything to even talk about. So it's amazing how long they stuck with this title through so much garbage. And Daredevil wasn't even especially well connected with the rest of the Marvel universe at this time. I mean, characters would walk through and there would be sort of cameos and crossovers, but I never got the feeling that he was integral. He wasn't part of anybody's team or anything like that. It's always a mystery to me about why this stuff is. That said, I agree with the comment on the art, because Colan is at this point a thoroughly competent comic book artist. He's about to get a lot better, especially once like Tom Palmer and people like that start getting on the inks. But as I was flipping through this, the storytelling feels a little ahead of its time. If you had told me this comic was from 1970 or 1973 or something like that, I would have no problem believing that. It feels much more like a Bronze Age comic than a Silver Age comic in terms of the storytelling, the amount of detail that's in the panels. I mean, we're a long step forward from like Larry Lieber and stuff like that by the time we get to this. This is a fully professional art job on a story that Stan must have written it on the toilet or something. It presents as a perfectly serviceable comic book.
Can we put that blurb on the cover when it's republished? Rob Salkowitz says it presents as a perfectly serviceable comic book.
Yeah.
Don't try to oversell us.
One other quick note is whatever you can say about the character concept, Gladiator is a badass looking villain.
Yeah.
And he's kind of stood the test of time. I think he wears that mask in case he has to scratch his nose and forgets about those things on his arms. Even when I was a little kid, I thought that Gladiator was just a cool villain design. So kudos to whoever came up with that.
Yeah, I think that was John Romita Sr. who designed him.
Yeah.
Just a couple things. On page 8, panel 4, bottom center, where, one of the folks who makes up the Tri-Man, probably the wrestler, is looking around for Daredevil, who is snuck between his legs. And I don't know, man, the wrestler there looks almost like he's presenting. It's just the way he's got his straight legs and he's just sort of bending way over, and it's just like that. Okay, that's an interesting choice there, Gene Colan. On page 9, final panel, at one point in the Mass Marauder's lair, Daredevil ends up finding a piece of equipment on some wheels that's this big, massive piece of equipment that he's going to use as a battering ram, and it is a mobile electronic calculator console. So it's just, oh yes, at one point a calculator would be so big that you could use it as a battering ram, or at least it would be plausible to think that you could use it as a battering ram. In the middle of the Gladiator battle, or I guess battle with the Gladiator in the Colosseum, the Gladiator kicks sand into Daredevil's eyes, and he says, "I can't let them suspect I'm blind. I'll have to act as though the sand impaired my eyesight, as though I'm trying to clear my eyes. I don't care if you're blind. Getting sand in your eyes is going to be unpleasant, and you are going to want to clear your eyes. That's not going to give anything away." You're good. I also like that after they filmed this, what they referred to as like a biblical epic movie, the movie producers were just like, what are we going to do with these lions? These mobsters over here want to buy them. Sure. Here, take them.
I know enough about the film industry in the 60s, so that is entirely believable to me.
I didn't say it was unbelievable. I just thought it was worth remarking upon.
I'll just say one last thing. Looking at my notes, I say that Lee keeps giving up books, and this month he walks away from Avengers, never to write it again. But he has not given up Daredevil. He is not letting anybody else lay a finger on Daredevil. He seems to love this book. The idea of letting Roy Thomas script Daredevil, he would rather chop off his left hand than let Roy Thomas script an issue of Daredevil. This is one of Marvel's first books, but you can't tell Stan that.
When you were talking about, why did this book keep on going? Here's my hypothesis on that and why he got his own book, whereas these other ones were half books. The publication of Daredevil by Marvel was basically them snatching an abandoned IP, that there had been a Golden Age character called Daredevil. And Martin Goodman apparently was always on the lookout for just going ahead and taking something from somebody else and being like, hey, this has value. I'm going to go ahead and take that value. I'm wondering if maybe it having its own separate title and never being given up on like this was just part of that, nope, I stole it and it's mine. I'm not giving it away.
No.
Which would explain that up until the point when Martin Goodman sold Marvel in about 2 years. But beyond that, I don't know.
But let Roy write the book. It's fine.
Good point.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to Thor number 135.
Yes, a much better book here. The Maddening Menace of the Super Beast. And this is just a fantastic issue right here. A Stan Lee, Jack Kirby feature fantasy. As Matt, you have been pointing out, this is towards the beginning of the period when Stan and Jack get co-storytelling credit with no specification as to art and writing. Delineation by Vincent Coletta, lettering by Artie Simek.
I said in one of our first episodes that everybody who says that the greatest crime in the history of mankind is the credits on Marvel Comics in the 60s. For the first year of Marvel Comics in the 60s, Stan and Jack got credited on the same line, and it was not said who was writer and who was artist. And every comic from late 1966 on, up through 1971, Stan and Jack, and then eventually Stan and all the pencilers, got credit on the same line without saying who was writer and who was artist. So this crime of the century took place within 1963 to mid-1966. That is when the crime of the century took place. It did not take place before or after that, so it was a limited crime of the century.
So at the end of last issue, we had met the High Evolutionary. We had seen that he was creating this highly evolved wolf. And of course, anything that's highly evolved is going to be more like a human, because that's how this stuff is assumed to work by non-scientists. And then when he created this wolf, he was distracted from his controls, and he was like, oh no, if it should turn out to be evil, then we're all in trouble. And then he thinks to himself, I feel and I hate. So yeah, that's not going to be good. Here is this highly evolved wolf that is called the Super Beast, and attacks Thor. The High Evolutionary knows that this is a bad thing, so he's getting his new men, who are also knights, basically. They're like high-tech knights that are all evolved animals of some sort. He's getting them to fight the Super Beast. High Evolutionary has basically the sort of equivalent of the little dog whistle, but it's a big, like, flugelhorn-looking thing, and it causes the evolved wolf much pain. I would think it would also happen to many of the other evolved animal creatures, but I guess not in this case. So the Super Beast is able to lock himself behind what looks like a vault door. Thor is going to go after him, but then the High Evolutionary points out that there is some kind of antimatter barrier between there. And I will give Stan credit where credit is due science-wise to point out that, yes, indeed, if you had a barrier of antimatter and you threw anything that is made of matter at it, it would have a massive explosion, which they demonstrate here.
Yes.
So meanwhile, in Asgard, Odin is distracted from watching a gladiator battle between Balder and some other person. You know, hey, Jan Victor awaits thy approbation, sire. Sire? Wilt thou not signal Balder to be at his ease? He says, yes, of course, I salute thee, yada, yada, yada. But he is very distracted by his premonitions of threatening stuff. Page 7. What can I say about page 7? What could I not say about page 7? This is a splash page showing Wundagore in all of its glory, with new men flying about it in their atomic steeds. And it is just peak Kirby fantasticness.
Yes.
It's got tons of Kirby tech. It's got, monumental sized backgrounds. It's got sort of a cosmic feel to it, even though it isn't in outer space. It is just absolutely fantastic. And Vince Colletta is not doing a bad job. We're going through a period here of several issues where Vince Colletta seems to be really putting in the effort. Either that or he hired a more competent assistant.
I was going to say, if Colletta inked this entire issue, I would eat my copy of it, because so there are a couple of areas where there's some trademark Colletta bullshit in it, especially on that extreme close-up of Odin on the previous page. Where you can see that there's all these little crow feet and stuff like that. But on pages like this and elsewhere, there's like solid blacks, there's bold stuff, there's backgrounds, there's none of the garbage that we associate with the Colletta phoned in ink jobs on this particular book. This is a first-class art job, no doubt about it.
Yeah, it's funny. The last two episodes, we had Rachel Gluckstern on as a guest, and we kept going like, this is like shockingly good Colletta inking on Thor. Wow, it's great. And she's like, what are you guys talking about? This sucks compared to Giacoya on Captain America or Synod on Fantastic Four. And we're like, oh, yes, we're just experiencing Stockholm Syndrome here. We've been a captive of Colletta so long that any little crumbs he throws us are just the most wonderful things in the world to us. Of course, it's nowhere near as good as Giacoya or Synod, but it's so much better than previous Colletta. Either he is getting to be a much better inker.
I've got no notes on that splash page. That splash page is as good as anything that is in any Kirby comic. That's some seriously well done artwork there.
Yeah, I will say that Synod probably would have brought just that extra little flourish to it. But yes, this is quite good. Okay, the High Evolutionary is worried that the Super Beast has locked himself into the evolution room, basically, and he is going to start cranking out an army of evil new men. And so we're trying to break in there and stop him from doing this, but it's too late. He has his army. We then see these two dudes who recruited Jane Foster in the previous couple of issues, who look vaguely weird, but not identifiably so. But apparently they
not
are
identifiably animals. So we had wondered when we first saw them, like, are these guys supposed to be new men? They look weird, but they don't look weird enough to be new men. And then here we find out they are new men, but we never find out what animal they're based off of. We can sort of guess from their names that Porga might have been a pig and Tagar might have been, I don't know, a lion or
tiger.
Something. But they are the most evolved of the new men. So you can't even tell what animal they started out as.
But yeah, when we first saw Porga is what you said his name was, I was like, I can't tell if his head is too big or his face is too small. But one way or the other. Tagar leaping into battle with the rest of the new men on page 10 is just, once again, fantastic page. And then just an all-out battle splash page on page 11. Again, we're just getting so much peak Kirby goodness in here. You were talking about some of the bad Coletta showing through. Page 12, panel in the bottom left-hand corner.
Yep.
That is the Coletta that we know and
loathe.
Although I find his take on Kirby Crackle to be kind of interesting, not necessarily being as careful and precise with it, kind of gives it a little bit more of an energy in some ways, or maybe not more of, but it still has a good energy to it.
The coloring on that panel is actually inspired. It actually looks really cool with the oranges, at least on the version that I'm looking at.
Oh, the coloring?
Yeah.
Yes, it is quite well done. In the end, Thor is able to, just through sheer strength and force of will, go ahead and vanquish the Super Beast. The High Evolutionary and the New Men drive these evil New Men into a ship, which they then eject off into space, sending them into an uninhabited galaxy. I'm like, any particular star or planet in that galaxy? I mean, that would seem to be important, but not here. They're just going to this place, and they're like, okay, good. They can go ahead and establish themselves, this civilization there. We then find out the High Evolutionary, who looks like a big alien dude or something like that, is really just an evolutionary scientist who was doing weird experiments you probably shouldn't be doing, and was having problems, so he went ahead and moved to this place, Wundagore, where he could do his experimentation without interference. But then he realizes that he cannot keep this here, and so it turns out that Wundagore is a rocket buried inside this mountain that just has the nose cone sticking out. And so he takes off to other stars in order to have his society out there. Eventually, now when does Counter-Earth come in? That's
coming, because High Evolutionary turns up in Thor in another 20 issues or so, right?
In about 10 issues in Fantastic Four, they're going to meet Adam Warlock, who at this point will just be called him, this orange artificial man. He will go off into space. He will come back briefly to kidnap Jane Foster, then go off into space again. And then we will get one of Marvel's biggest missed opportunities, where they do a really interesting book that ended up going through 4 writers and 4 artists over the course of 8 issues. It starts off with Thomas and Gil Kane doing a really nice job, in which it turns out that the High Evolutionary and his new men, and unfortunately the evil new men, all end up on Counter-Earth, an exact copy of Earth that is opposite to us in our orbit, so we can't see it because it's always on the other side of the sun. They have attempted to sort of create a new Eden out of new men on Counter-Earth, but the Man Beast is there as sort of the snake of the Eden, and then you get this really interesting Jesus parable with Adam Warlock as this Jesus-like figure going into this world and trying to save it. And then eventually this comes to the point when he dies by crucifixion. Ultimately, works much better when Starlin then took over Warlock, in him summarizing these issues. They sound a lot better than they actually were. So we've got a lot of story potential left here that is all created in this issue that then Marvel will get a tremendous amount of use out of, and then eventually it will become the basis for the Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. So let's just talk about what an amazing run of books Thor has had. Everybody talks about how good 1966 was in Fantastic Four, and 1966 Fantastic Four is one of the most legendary, years in any Marvel book ever, but 1966 Thor is right up there. This has been an amazing year for Thor.
1966 Kirby is like 1927 Babe Ruth. I mean, it's like the best guy ever having his best season ever is something to behold. And even this issue, which I wouldn't say is the top, is probably the best issue that a lot of comic creators could ever hope to do. And it's probably maybe cracks the top 10 of books that Kirby did this year. Or maybe it's in the top 20. I mean, Yeah, he was rolling, and Thor was really the place where he got to use his outdoor voice a little bit. There's some really amazing concepts. Because again, it's like I had forgotten what the actual origin of the High Evolutionary is. I really like him as a character and the way that he shows up in all of these places. And it's almost anticlimactic that he's just some dude in armor because he has an outsized role in Marvel mythology, as Matt just went through, and plus all of the stuff that involves like the Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver and all of that. It's like he's a really interesting character, and his origin is just weakly pedestrian. But other than that, like this is a banger. Like this is good stuff going on in this book.
Yeah.
Matt, had you had everything you had to say about this?
Yeah, let's just quickly summarize Tales of Asgard.
Yeah, so Tales of Asgard, there's really not that much to summarize. It's just a fantastic 4 pages of Thor, Hogun the Grim, and Fandral the Dashing fighting Fafnir. It's just some fantastic action. I can't really say that much about it. The final page just has Odin saying, only with the defeat of Fafnir can the dead domain of Nastron live again. Of course, they're not acknowledging that, as I pointed out 2 episodes ago, the dead domain of Nastron is dead because Odin genocided the place. I mean, they specifically say they rebelled against Asgard, and so Odin cleansed the entire world of all life. It's like,
Yep.
Okay, that doesn't sound like something that the good guys should be doing. So he's saying, well, as long as we finish the job and have the complete genocide of this world, then I can let it live again. So I'm a little bit on Fafnir's side in this one. It just really seems, I don't know. This one's weird, but certainly the action and the art are fantastic.
More uncharacteristically competent inks here on this one as well.
Yes. Thoughts? Anyone?
Fun issue. I guess Volstagg is still...
You got your 12 cents worth.
Oh, yeah. I guess Volstagg is still conked out somewhere, which is a shame. I always love getting my maximum Volstagg in every issue, but it's a great story.
Yeah, I think he's still stashed away in the cave that Fafnir, lured him into.
Okay, so should we go ahead and move on to Tales to Astonish, number 86, featuring Submariner and the Incredible Hulk?
I don't see why not.
All right, we have a pretty good colon cover. It says, the wrath of Warlord Krang. Krang and Dorma are still white. Finally, we have a reason for this. About, 10 issues ago, they decided we're going to go on a mission to the surface world, so we'd better turn ourselves into white people and then get in our ship and go to the surface world. But then they got to the surface world and they never got out of their ship. And they've just been going around in their ship all of this time, doing all sorts of nasty deeds, and nobody even knew that they were white people. Here they come out, but it's not like they're like, let's get jobs as secretaries, let's do something where we have to pass as white. No, there's still absolutely no reason for them to do it. And then, as it turns out, they turn back blue anyway. So on the cover, we see that they are pointing at a gigantic tsunami, which is seemingly destroying New York. There's various people inside a building shooting guns at Namor while he is also trying to deal with the tsunami. It's an exciting cover.
They're clearly soldiers. They've got army helmets and are wearing green.
Yeah, I guess my coloring is muddier than your coloring. I'm looking at scans of the original issues, and you're looking at the Marvel Unlimited version. Yeah, it's not clear in this version, but I can see what you're saying now. We jump into the issue, and we have a shocker. We have had a lot of new and interesting pencilers show up recently. I realized that when John Buscema showed up last month, we never actually did any sort of bio of John Buscema, which I felt bad about. We sort of forgot to do that. Here we have a shocking penciler who I did not know ever drew for Marvel. Story by Stan Lee, penciling by Mary Jerry Grandenetti, inking by Wild Bill Everett, inking with a heavy hand, and lettering by adorable Artie Simek. So Jerry Grandenetti was a big DC War Comics person. I'm surprised he is penciling for Marvel under his own name here. I guess they've sort of gotten past the era of people in DC having to use fake names to draw for Marvel, even though Grandenetti was still very much a regular DC penciler at this point. When I think of Grandenetti, I think of a comic that I collected obsessively as a child, and that is Prez First Teenage President. He was the co-creator of Prez First Teenage President, a delightful comic, and I enjoyed quite a bit, and I collected a full run of when I was a kid. I was such a big collector of it that I considered trying to track down a copy of Canceled Comics Cavalcade number 2, in which they had the never-before-printed 5th issue of Prez. That is an extremely valuable comic. It would have cost me thousands of dollars to get a copy of, because this was after the DC implosion where they canceled half of their books. They had all of these issues of the canceled books left over, and they decided for copyright purposes to go ahead and publish them in a massive low print run phone book style book called Canceled Comics Cavalcade. And I wanted to buy it just to get Prez, but I didn't do it. Jerry Grandenetti had an excellent career on Beyond Prez, mainly doing war books. He received the ultimate honor, or dubious honor, of having 2 of his panels turned into Roy Lichtenstein prints. You look up these Wikipedia pages for the Roy Lichtenstein prints, and they say, like, oh, based off, art from Man of War number 82 or whatever, and it doesn't say who the artist is. Like, the fact that Lichtenstein paintings are still hanging in museums without saying Lichtenstein, after Grandenetti is insane, and the fact that you have Wikipedia pages for these Lichtenstein paintings that don't list the artist is insane.
I would go farther than saying it's unusual to see him in a Marvel comic. It's practically unique to see Grandenetti drawing superheroes at all. This is a guy that he came out of the Will Eisner studio. He has one of the most idiosyncratic, weird styles of anybody I know from the DC War books, but he also drew a bunch of stuff for Warren, for Eerie and Creepy magazine, of which I have some originals on my wall, and they are gorgeous. And this guy is like way out there. And the only person that is even slightly less appropriate for Marvel than Jerry Grandenetti is Alex Toth, who did the one issue of X-Men, as far as I know, that was a stinker. And here we've got Grandenetti obviously completely lost with human anatomy, with everything that has to do with this story, except the sound effects in the backgrounds, which are magnificent. But everything else in this story is so weird. And I'm sure they were like, yeah, next, like that. And the inking does him no favors either. Like, there's some actually just weirdly terrible inking throughout. This was really fascinating. This is not a story that I can ever remember encountering before. And it's like, wow, what a bad idea.
Well, I mean, you forgot it because it's so forgettable. One thing I'll say is when you're talking about, an artist who is known for doing some stuff well and they show up in a superhero book and it's like, oh dear God, what is this thing? Early on in the Thor comic, shortly after Kirby left for about a year, Al Hartley came on and drew an issue. And, he is more known for doing like the Patsy Walker books and the Millie the Model books and stuff like that. And he does a great job with that stuff. But yeah, not good with Thor and aliens. At all.
No.
These Submariners look like they were drawn by Fletcher Hanks or something. I mean, they're surreal. The passing familiarity with human anatomy that like occasionally creeps through on these is fascinating. It's so strange.
Well, you've got 2 Golden Age guys, Will Everett, who created the Submariner, and then Jerry Grandenetti, who actually got a start I did mention before, ghosting Will Eisner into the Spirit. You've got these 2 sort of Golden Age sensibilities that are sort of clashing with each other. They're not melding together well. I think I like the art more than you do. I think I certainly like Everett's thinking more than you do, but it's a bizarre issue. Namor is still chasing after Dorma and Krang. Dorma and Krang decide to finally attack the surface world, which they've been sort of planning to do for the last 10 issues. And whoo boy, did they attack the surface world. They cause a huge tsunami that is taller than the Empire State Building to completely swamp New York City. And we see seemingly millions of people killed by this. We see these huge waves attack the city. However, Dorma then says to Krang, stop it, I beg you, while still no lives have been lost. It's like, still no lives have been lost when the entire city has been destroyed. What do you mean? Apparently, she is an excellent casualties estimator. She can tell that nobody has actually died. We have a bizarre sort of storyline where instead of Namor going like, I will go confront the supervillain, he's like, I'd better get on the radio. I'd better find a radio transmitter and try to call the cops on the villain and tell the cops where they can find Krang's UFO. And that's what he does. He takes over a radio booth. He goes through various trouble. The humans don't trust him. They're trying to shut him down. But it works. He manages to radio a submarine that blows up Krang and Dorma's ship while they're out of it. But then they are returning to it. And they're like, uh-oh, our ship just got blown up. And then a helicopter comes in and swoops them up in a net. And Submariner's whole plan of calling the cops on Krang and Dorma has worked. But then the people still think Submariner's working with them. They are chasing after him with guns. Meanwhile, while Krang and Dorma are hanging upside down in their nets, sort of like Return of the Jedi when our heroes have been captured by the Ewoks, they start turning blue and start being unable to breathe because their formula is wearing off, they then are very clear on the fact that all of our characters are converging in Columbus Circle. They say many times, this is Columbus Circle. Well, Jerry Grandenetti was born and raised in New York City, but he seemingly has never been to Columbus Circle because there is absolutely no attempt in the art to create a feeling of Columbus Circle here in this art. There is no huge statue of Columbus, for instance, which is a good way of indicating it is Columbus Circle. Storm and Krang, dangling from a helicopter, Submariner, and the entire U.S. Army are all converging on Columbus Circle for a big confrontation, and that is the end of this issue. I would say I didn't dislike it as much as you did, Rob. I'd say it's not a terrible issue. I'm very glad that this sort of 10-issue storyline is finally coming to some sort of conclusion, and they are finally blue again, and they're finally attacking the surface world. Namor is finally defeating them. The Grandenetti art, I think it's an interesting what could have been to have this artist who certainly had some quality work in his lifetime doing just one Marvel comic. I would not say that Everett is harming him. I would say Everett is probably improving him, making him look more like a superhero comic artist. I generally tend to like Everett's inking. I think this is an interesting issue, but it sounds like you disagree, Rob.
It's not uninteresting. It is interesting. And I think that Grandenetti's artwork is fascinating. It's just weird. And I think it's more a conflict of styles. It's like if you had to put those two guys on the book, for God's sake, have Everett pencil it and Grandenetti ink it. That would seem like a better solution here. But you can see why he probably didn't do a whole lot more for Marvel. Maybe he did like a Tower of Shadows or something like that somewhere down the line. But yes, I don't know. I mean, the Submariner storyline, I can kind of take it or leave it. It's like he gets better and worse over these different stories. So this was good, but it was fascinating. Both art choices on both ends of this book are interesting to me.
Yes, they are.
Just a few of my observations. Yeah, that tidal wave was, I mean, the massive, monumental, titanic, world-ending force of that tidal wave as it is drawn is just, I think even as a kid, if I saw this, I would have been like, nobody's killed. Really? So, I mean, on page 3, final panel, you're looking from one side of Manhattan as the tidal wave is coming towards you, and some of the water is actually gonna land in the other side of Manhattan. Right? Like it's not even like it's just flowing through the city. It's like, no, this has actually cleared the entire island and it's going to the other side. And there's a little helicopter that's only about half as high up as the top of the wave. It's like, okay, dude, okay, let's calm it down just a little bit. We want some plausible deniability that anyone would have died here. When some of the regular citizens are trying to stop Submariner because they think he's the one behind the tidal wave and he's in the radio broadcasting room, some of the folks in the crowd are trying to take him out themselves, and somebody gets the idea of trying to shock the Submariner while he's operating the controls, and to do this, they open up a high-voltage power panel and are handling this high-voltage wire with their bare hands, which...
Don't try this at home, kids.
No, do not. And if the whole thing is that you're going to use this high voltage to subdue the very, very superpowered Submariner, maybe regular human being, you don't want to be touching that with your bare hands. You know, as I've said a number of times, I like the Submariner when he is a foil to other characters. I've never really liked much of when they do stuff with him as the protagonist in Silver Age comics. I love him as an antagonist. I don't like him much as a protagonist. But, so we're just getting what we get.
Yep. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the back half of the book with the Incredible Hulk. The birth of the Hulk Killer. I was surprised that Buscema is back. Superlative script, Smiling Stanley. Ameliorative art, jovial John Buscema, imaginative inks, mirthful Mickey DeMeo, lucrative lettering, adorable Artie Simek. So once again, Mickey DeMeo, really Mike Esposito. So last issue we had John Buscema making his Marvel debut on this book with inks by John Tartaglione, was that his name? I was not a fan at all of that book. Then later we had Buscema also make his simultaneous debut on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. with Frank Giacoia inking, and that was so much better. I first read the Buscema Tartaglione, and I'm like, oh, is Buscema not a good penciler yet? But then I saw him inked by Giacoia, and I thought he was great. Well, here we have sort of splitting the difference. Mickey DeMeo is another good inker, Mike Esposito, and he does pretty good over Buscema in this issue. It's still not great. I think it's not as good as Giacoya, but I think it's better than Tortiglione. What did you guys think of these things?
I thought they were fine. They're not remarkable really one way or the other. I was really more noticing that it seems like John Buscema hasn't really found his voice, as it were, with his superhero art yet. And I do not know how much of what we're seeing from Mike Esposito is a result of that.
You're a little more generous than I am on this. I would agree that Buscema is almost there. I think this is better than like the very, very earliest stuff that we've seen of him from Marvel. And I think that the Hulk gives him a chance to, he's very good at anatomy. He very likes drawing big muscly people and stuff like that. But this inking is just incompetent. Like all those little hash stroke marks and stuff like that on figure after figure. It is very distracting, actually. You get to some of these panels and all of the muscles are delineated in that one particular way. And it just looks sketchy and weird. The faces aren't properly rendered. If you had gotten Bill Everett to ink this, it would have looked a hell of a lot better, in my opinion. That was the singular downfall. Like the shots are good. The penciling looks strong. Like the storytelling is good. There's lots of good stuff in here. And as soon as they get a decent inker on him or they let him ink himself, then things are going to be okay with John Buscema, I think.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that we've got very Coletta inks here.
It's worse than Coletta because Coletta at least mixes it up. I don't know. Look at all these like little weird stroke marks all over everything. It's just it's just not clean. It makes the whole page look hairy.
Well, I certainly consider it to be better than Coletta.
The hairy look that you're talking about, it reminds me a little bit of Hulk right around the time of like the mindless Hulk who is at the crossroads of the universes or whatever, where it was Sal Buscema, so John Buscema's brother, inked by, and I don't know how to pronounce his name. I think it's a Filipino artist, but Jerry Talayoc or something that. The hairy thing that you're describing reminds me of that.
Yeah, I guess I hadn't really thought about with these two issues of Hulk we've had drawn by John Buscema. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, his brother would go on to be, in my mind, the ultimate Hulk artist.
We still have a few more years before Sal Buscema is ready for primetime, I think.
Let's go ahead and read The Birth of the Hulk Killer. I really like this first page where Bruce Banner is still on this missile that is about to blow up New York, and we have this sheer panic in the streets, which is well drawn by Buscema, of people going absolutely crazy. We then cut to Bruce Banner on the missile. He manages to disable it. It's amazing he can hold on to the missile, not having super strength, but somehow he does. He disables the missile, and then just when the missile is about to crash into the harbor, thankfully he turns back to the Hulk so he can survive the crash. We then get to, we've talked about how poor the plotting has been on Incredible Hulk for this entire year. We've had a lot of just atrocious plotting. Well, the atrocious plotting just continues. Your number one job as a comic books plotter is to get the hero and the villain in the same place at the same time in a believable way. That is your job. Once they're in the same place at the same time, you can trust them to start fighting and fill up the rest of the pages. But for the first half of the book, you have to get them in the same place at the same time. Like so many recent issues, there is absolutely no reason, no explanation of how they end up in the same place at the same time. We cut to, presumably out in the desert southwest, you would think. They're still raiding the leader's laboratories, even though they say he's been dead since issue 74, so that was exactly a year ago.
But here's my thing about that. Last time we saw the leader, wasn't his headquarters in Rome?
Yes, true.
So, I was sitting here thinking, like, what are these American police in Rome somehow? Like, what's going on? I don't get it.
They don't say where it is, but I guess this must be New York.
Yeah.
When Ditko was penciling and presumably writing this book with the humanoids, these big, strong robot things, but they were spongy, and so they were very hard to beat up, which I thought was just a brilliant conceit of Ditko and Lee. So I'm very glad to see another humanoid back. I like the humanoids, but they find one in a lab. They're like, oh, it's the ultimate Hulk fighting humanoid. And they're like, oh, should we send it to fight the Hulk? And they're sort of two minds about this. They can't decide whether to do it. Meanwhile, the Hulk has fished himself out of the drink and met back up with Rick Jones. Meanwhile, I complained to this issue that that Boomerang was nowhere to be seen. Now, as you pointed out, Steve, why would I want Boomerang to be here? He's a tremendously lame character. Well, because we were in the middle of a big Boomerang storyline where he had been hired by the Secret Empire to steal the Orion missile. Well, then the Secret Empire was taken care of in two other books over in the Namor half of this book and in the S.H.I.E.L.D. half of Strange Tales. What happens when the Boomerang goes home to report back to the Secret Empire if they've been defeated in other books. We have to deal with this in 2 different books this month because they finally do show us Boomerang again, who does indeed go like, Secret Empire, guys, here I am. What happened, everybody? And we get the same thing this month with the Super Adaptoid in Captain America, who was working for AIM, who was also dispatched in those 2 books. And then the Super Adaptoid's like, hey, everybody, I defeated Captain America. AIM, guys, who's there? Hello. So we just briefly see the Boomerang realizing he's done all this for nothing. We then get back to the humanoid, who is suddenly fighting the Hulk. How did they end up in the same city? How did they end up in the same place? Neither is attacking the other. The humanoid has not gone off in search of the Hulk. The Hulk has not gone off in search of the humanoid. They just happen to run across each other. It is truly atrocious plotting. But then they fight, and I always like Hulk fighting humanoids, and that's where the issue ends. By the way, we've been letting Hulk get away with ending issues on Hulk-inued next-ish, and we have never once called them out on that. Can we just ask the question of why they've fallen in love with the word Hulk-inued? Which is, that's not clever wordplay.
I blame the Batman TV show for that one.
Yeah. I would guess so. Anyway, Rob, what did you think of this issue?
I like this era of Hulk. I think that the whole storyline throughout these Tales to Astonish issues is good. I mean, there's action, there's like bubbling subplots. This wasn't the highlight of it. I think once we get into the Gil Kane issues that are coming up, I think in a little bit, that it gets a little bit better. But I always found this to be an enjoyable title. And so it's a good, not the greatest installment of that story, but if you read the whole thing, if you get the Hulk like omnibus, that you need to be the Hulk to be able to lift up, but that has everything from like Hulk #1 through like the first 10 issues of Hulk or something like that. It actually reads as a pretty good continuous story. So hats off to them. They're doing a good job with that.
Yeah, but that's one of the things I always liked about the Hulk, is the Hulk has this real shaky dog feeling to it. You know, Ditko very much did this when he was penciling and co-writing the book. It was always a cliffhanger, always just going off in crazy different directions. And I do really like that element of the Hulk. Of all of the shaky dog type stories that Marvel did, Hulk was the shackiest and doggiest.
Well, and also Hulk on his worst day is better than the best Daredevil up until we get like issue number 98 or something. I mean, it's mind-boggling to me that they could have kept their copyright by keeping him as 8 pages in the back of Tales to Astonish, backing up Submariner or something like that. But what can you do?
Who knows? I did definitely make a note of the fact that Thunderbolt Ross is saying, of course we'll find a way to animate this ultimate Hulk beating humanoid. I'll have our top research expert here before nightfall. And then just very shortly thereafter, there's another panel where Glenn Talbot is saying, we should never have brought the humanoid to life. He's completely out of control. He'll tear the city apart. And it's like, oh, if it isn't the consequences of my own actions. Then I'm like, oh, well, maybe they'll learn something from this and start making better decisions. But then also in that same panel, Glenn Talbot then says, get the atomic flamethrower. So no, they have not learned their lesson and started making better decisions.
This right here is why Peter Parker does not want to join the army.
Yeah.
He knows what he would be in for.
Yes, he would
He'd end up in the Hulkbusters, and that would be it.
But yeah, I see what you mean, Rob, that especially on the Ultimate Hulk humanoid or whatever they call it, the inking generally tends to be pretty bad on that in particular. Bottom of page 7 just looks like, I sometimes talk about how this isn't Dick Ayers, but with Dick Ayers, you can get one of 2 Dick Ayers. You can get the pretty good Dick Ayers inking, and then you can get the he busted out his mop inking. And that particular one looks like he busted out the mop, as opposed to, say, the last panel on page 4 that looks like somebody with less talent than Bill Everett trying to look like Bill Everett and failing. I can definitely see what you're saying on that.
Sure. Just say a few more things about Boomerang. So Boomerang was wearing a very loose-fitting blouse under the previous artist on this book. Now his shirt has seemingly shrunk in the wash, showing that he is actually quite strong, and it's now a skin-tight shirt over a muscle-bound guy, still covered in red washers, because, of course, the last thing he ever wants to do is throw a boomerang when he could throw red washers at people. At this point, again, he was working for an organization that has ceased to exist, and so he just starts ranting to us about, but look, I've still got my red washers I can throw at people. Don't people want to hire me? And look, I've still got my boot jets, and to prove that his boot jets work well, he flies through a flaming hoop. So this man is alone in his house. He has lit a hoop on fire, and he is jumping through the flaming hoop to show how good he is at flying. I don't know if anybody in the history of mankind has ever lit a hoop on fire just to prove to themselves how good they are at something and leapt through the hoop. I think that generally speaking, that's something where you're only going to do it if other people are looking at you. And I will point out that I briefly got excited when I saw there was a letter. I misread it. I thought there was a letter from Gary Groth, publisher of Fantagraphics, and then I realized it's Gary Groff, Groff, who is an entirely different person. So then I was not excited anymore. Anyway, yes, let's move on to X-Men.
All right. So re-enter the Mimic. Now, this is, once again, you talk about atrociously plotted. This is just an in medias res? How do you pronounce that?
Medias with an S. People always leave off the S. In medias res.
Yeah, so we start out with this in medias res storytelling device here. For no real reason, I don't really see what this adds to the story. Anyway, the Mimic is fighting the X-Men, and we do have Marvel Girl here. We do not have the Angel here. They have some slightly improved uniforms here. So we see that there's some red that's been added to them. It's not just a yellow sort of sleeveless jersey that they've got on over the blue unitard anymore. It looks much more like the uniforms that the New Mutants are going to have in like 20 years.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of these new costumes.
Yeah.
This is not a good issue, but it's all worth it for the new costumes. I like them.
Yeah. So we see the Mimic fighting the X-Men and doing quite a good job at fighting the X-Men, looking like he has defeated them. And then it's like, okay, well, now let's go back and tell you how we got here. Angel had been injured in the previous issue. They determine that he will recover, but he needs to not exert himself or else he will lose his ability to fly in the future until he heals. So then meanwhile, we see Jean at Metro College, and we see that she is getting close with this boy that she has seen in the last few issues. What is his name again? I'm not remembering here, but she's watching him at some kind of athletic competition. So she's seeing him running in a tank top and shorts, diving into the pool in his swim trunks, and she likes some beefcake there. Seems like we're about to get...
His name is Ted, and then he keeps mentioning his brother Ralph, who will also go on to be a character. But yes, his name is Ted.
And we don't yet know what's going to be happening with Ralph, but we get a little bit of foreshadowing that's not going to pay off yet. So meanwhile, there's some sort of explosion in one of the university buildings. It has blown up on Cal Rankins, who is otherwise known as the Mimic, and it has just undone the mind wipe that Professor X had put on him. Then the Puppet Master. What? Why? How did the Puppet Master show up in this? This makes no sense. And so somehow the Puppet Master decides to carve a puppet of Professor X, even though at one point he says, "It is the irresistible icon of one whose true name I know not, but that is of no importance. For I do know is he is the secret leader of the powerful X-Men." Again, secret identity is just not a good thing in the Marvel Universe, since Charles Xavier is a well-known media figure who is an expert on mutation. So if you know what he looks like and you know he leads the X-Men, then you know he's Professor X, who also runs this school that has this... Anyway, never mind. So, but it seems like it doesn't even work for the Puppet Master to take over Charles Xavier.
Well, most recently we had this Puppet Master show up in Namor and try to take over Namor, and bizarrely they never mentioned that he had already taken over Namor in the early days of the Fantastic Four. Here they do mention that Puppet Master has already previously tried to take over Charles Xavier in a crossover between the X-Men and the Fantastic Four, and they make it clear that it doesn't work this time because Professor Xavier is like, well, I'm never going to let that happen again. And he put on a certain sort of a whammy in his brain to keep it from ever working again. So at least they do acknowledge that, hey, we've already done this plot and it didn't work the first time and it's not going to work the second time.
But why bring him into this? It's just utterly baffling.
I think it's because they wanted to redeem Calvin Rankin the Mimic, but they wanted them to fight. And I think that that Stan, as editor here, keeps going back to is when I want two people to fight, but they don't have a good reason to fight, bring in the Puppet Master.
So we see Professor X releasing his astral form to go out and try to find help for the approaching Mimic, who he somehow knows is coming. We see once again that he actually like leaps and bounds and runs in his astral form to get from one place to another. And actually, you were talking about Fletcher Hanks earlier. Page 10, panel 4 looks a little more Fletcher Hanks to me than the one you were mentioning earlier. By the way, for anyone out there in podcast land who doesn't know, Fletcher Hanks did a Golden Age comic called, what is it, Stardust? Yeah, which was just utterly nuts and not that well drawn, but has a very distinctive style, and this is reminding me of it a little bit. In Thor last month, we found out that Wanda Maximoff owns a Porsche in Europe.
Lamborghini.
Oh, sorry. One way or the other, she likes high-end European race cars and racing them around, which I've never heard of before or since. Now we find out she's a falconer. Okay, that would have been interesting information to have before now, and would be interesting to follow up on later, and neither of those things happen. So Professor Xavier is trying to contact them mentally and see whether they would want to join the fight against Cal Rankins. And they're like, no, we're doing our thing in Europe here. He's like, okay, cool. Good on you. Bobby and Hank, they are going on another double date with Zelda and Vera. They're just going to eat street and go up to a hot dog vendor. I like how Hank says to Vera, may I offer you a sumptuous Frankfurter, Vera? Which just seems a little unfortunately lascivious there.
I gotta say, it's somewhat triggering to me to read this because when I recently visited New York City with my family, my kids were like, we want to order a hot dog from a hot dog stand. And we're like, okay. And we went to a hot dog stand off of Bryant Park and ordered a hot dog, and I went ahead and ordered myself a gyro, and they got their hot dogs and liked them. I got a gyro, and the gyro was made, instead of tzatziki sauce, was made with mayonnaise. I don't like mayonnaise, but I get the feeling even if I loved mayonnaise, a gyro with mayonnaise is just wrong, and I was traumatized. And so seeing anybody ordering New York street food is painful to me.
I really like mayonnaise, and that sounds disgusting. That is not, that is not good. I thought you were going to say that the food cart guy only sold halab halash and crab juice. But
wait, what was that a reference to?
It was a Simpsons episode. It was the one actually that was set at the Twin Towers. And actually at Heroes Con last weekend, I saw somebody wearing a t-shirt that was for Halab Halash brand crab juice, which I thought was a fantastic deep cut. Bobby and Hank end up seeing a bank robbery happening, so they have to once again duck out in the middle of their date and have some terrible excuse and look really bad. Why these girls keep on going out with these two, I do not understand. But they go to do something about the bank robbery, but Spider-Man gets them. So then they're like, oh, hey, Spider-Man, would you want to come and join the X-Men and help us do this stuff? And he's like, no. Okay, well, I guess that wasted a couple of pages, so good, we're that much closer to the end. And then the professor shows up in his Rolls Royce to go to Metro College, I guess, to get Jean. This is the next day. Cal Rankins is like, hey, all these people are showing up and suddenly my powers are coming back. Like, okay, this is awesome. So he follows them back to the X-Mansion, bursting out with his powers. It turns out that Jean has made these new uniforms because, of course, whenever there are new uniforms that show up, it's just because one of the female heroes decided that she wanted to go ahead and use her sewing hobby to make everybody new uniforms because that's what girls do. But I will say, these uniforms are an improvement. They're a subtle change, but they make a big difference. So yes, at this point, the puppet master realizes he can manipulate Cal Rankins, who didn't start off seeming to bear that much ill will towards them. Maybe a little bit, but not a huge amount. At one point, Professor X mentions that he has traced the puppet master's radioactive brainwaves to a location not far away. So I guess the puppet master has been working with that radioactive clay a little bit too long, and now it's affecting his brain waves at this point. They go and they find the puppet master's hideout. What is this big, some kind of android that he has in here? Oh, and by the way, I think that the year of Soupy sales is officially over, since here on page 17, panel 6, Cyclops says, don't worry, Jean, I see it. It's some sort of incredible android. Iceman says, I didn't think it was Ringo Starr. Anywhere from the books marked February through October this year, that would have been Soupy sales. I don't know whether you're aware of this, Rob, but throughout 1966, they've kept on making Soupy sales jokes and references just every month and sometimes multiple times in a month.
Yeah, we've run across at least 10 references to Soupy
Yeah.
Sales, and you're right, that would have been a Soupy Sales reference. They also
Yes.
seem to have gotten over to saying Pussycat constantly, so the year of Soupy
Yes.
Sales and Pussycat is over with this December's books.
Had you never noticed this, Rob?
I had not.
See, this is one of the things you get from going through and reading all of these in their full context. You get this other rich layer of text where you figure out, oh, Soupy Sales is clearly he has reached the peak of his cultural significance.
Rob, if you want that Eisner Award, I'm just saying, the Soupy Sales beat is not the worst way to
Get
do
on
it.
the Soupy Sales train. Got it.
So I guess they've established before that sometimes the Puppet Master can also have other large android-like things. I think in an issue of Fantastic Four, he made himself a Pegasus or something like that he flew off on. One way or the other, it's just ridiculousness. At one point, Cyclops defeats him by blowing a hole in the floor, and he falls down into the floor. And then Roy Thomas has this explanatory dialogue for no reason. Just says, luckily, there was a cave beneath the floor into which our playmate could fall. And it's just like, what, you have to explain they're not on a pad? Like, it's just, you made a hole, he fell down. That's all we need to know. And then they finally figure out the reason Cal Rankins has his angel wings, even though Angel isn't there, is that he has come out to that area, even though he's supposed to be resting, to try to help the X-Men. And they're worried now that his wings may be permanently damaged, but they do not know yet. And what happened to the Mimic at the end here? Does he just walk off? No, I think he's just still there.
Yeah, feeling bad.
And just no longer being controlled by the Puppet Master because Warren destroyed his puppet. Anyway, next episode, they let us know we're going to get a super racist caricature of Irish people. Cool.
Yes, the Banshee, who will go on to become a major character. Yes, so I thought this was a merely adequate issue of X-Men. I thought that they wrapped up the love triangle too quickly. Warren just suddenly changes his mind, and at the end of last issue, he'd announced, Scott shot me on purpose because he loves Jean and I love Jean too, and it's a love triangle. But in this one, Warren sort of wakes up again and says, nope, I've changed my mind. There's no love triangle. Scott didn't shoot me on purpose. And the whole thing wraps up a little too easily. I'm very tired of seeing Wanda and Pietro show up in every book except for the Avengers. The Avengers desperately need them. And why can't they show up in the Avengers? But anyway, Rob, what do you think of this issue?
Boy, the X-Men is like the kitchen drain trap of the Marvel universe at this point. It's like stuff that was once fresh when it's sitting on the counter. By the time it ends up in X-Men is garbage. I mean, it's shocking to me that this would end up becoming a good book, that Roy Thomas was going to end up becoming a good writer and all of this, because that evidence is not present in this one. We're obviously saving the best for last here. So sorry if I'm sounding a little bit negative on a couple of these books, but boy, it's always shocking to go back because it's like, did I remember these wrong? Are these better than I thought they were? X-Men is not better than I thought it was. Because here you've got another recycled concept that we also see another time this month, which is like, what if there was somebody that had all the powers of the group in one guy? And it's like, you start off with Super Skrull, right? Super Skrull is good. Then you've got Super Adaptoid, who's going to show up in another issue this month. And then finally, you've got Mimic. Those guys should form like a super villain group or something like that, just because then they have all the bases covered. But it's like, there's one idea that it's like, it's good the first time, it's okay the second time. And by the time you see it in X-Men is like not good. You know, you've got the unfortunate Warner Roth doing the artwork here. It's like, you know, direct to video Kirby imitation. It's just everything about this is substandard, and it's a shame. And it really stands out because there are some all-time classics out this month, and this is not one of them.
Yeah.
I love that you guys take the complete view, because for every Fantastic Four and Thor, there's an X-Men or a Daredevil, and that's a fact. That's how Marvel was.
Yeah, we should say that you wanted to come on for this month of comics because of the Strange Tales Shield story that is coming up. So if people are just listening to this episode going like, wow, did you guys drab Rob Salkowitz in here to cover a bunch of bad comics? No, you are very excited to cover a comic that will be at our next episode.
There's another high point that we're getting to here that's but we haven't yet.
Oh, yes.
Next episode. Just you wait, folks.
Yep. So that ends this particular episode. We will be back next week with Rob Salkowitz still with us and deal with 4 more books that also have, as you said, some fantastic milestone moments in them. I am excited for that. And Rob, you have already plugged your pluggables earlier. Anything else you want to say to podcast land before we end this episode and start recording the next?
Just that this episode is probably going to come out within the time frame of San Diego Comic-Con. I'm going to be at San Diego. I'm going to be doing a bunch of panels that I can't talk about exactly yet, but they're awesome, and they cover all kinds of fun stuff about comics history and comics journalism and comics in academia, graphic novels, and just the whole 9 yards. So anybody that hears this episode, sees me walking around Comic-Con, come up and say hi.
Cool.
And I guess that's where the Eisner Awards are going to be, in San Diego, right? I think last time you were on, you mentioned having served on the Lifetime Achievement Award or the Hall of Fame committee, and you said something like how Don Heck had been nominated, and you said something to the effect of like, isn't the whole point of having a Hall of Fame to keep Don Heck out? And
that sounds like something I would say. For this reason, I have never actually been selected as an Eisner judge of anything. The closest I've come to it is getting nominated, which honestly is better, I think. But particularly on the Hall of Fame stuff, I have some tangy opinions about that being one of them, yeah.
Did Don Heck make it in, do you know?
I don't know. George Tuska was up also, which is like, really? It's like the hall of people who showed up and collected a paycheck? Is that what we're calling it now?
Okay, let's go ahead and wrap up this episode, and then we will record the next one. Goodbye, America.
And goodbye, the rest of the world. Take care and stay safe out there. Thanks for listening to Marvel Reread Club. Please subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Your reviews and ratings are a great help and always appreciated. We love hearing from you. Go to marvelrereadclub.com to find notes and join the discussion about this episode. We're also on Facebook and Instagram. See you next time.